Welcome to Gorillapreneur, the Art of Waging Small Business Warfare podcast, teaching Davids how to defeat Goliaths. Now here's your host, Mark Anthony Peterson.
Welcome back to the podcast for entrepreneurs, startups, and business mavericks. If you're not a maverick, you don't have to go home, but you got to get up out of this podcast. In this podcast, we teach entrepreneurs how to defeat the corporate giant. Just like in the story of David and Goliath, David defeated a much taller and stronger Goliath, not by fighting the giant in hand-to-hand combat, but by using technology, a slingshot. The slingshot allowed the smaller David to attack from a distance that minimized the advantages that Goliath had over the smaller David. My name is Mark Anthony Peterson. I'm a serial entrepreneur, a futurist, and the managing executive at Serial Consulting, a leading small business strategy and technology consulting firm. I am also the author of the book Gorillapreneur, Small Business Strategy for Davids Wanting to Defeat Goliaths, which is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iTunes. This podcast is brought to you by Serial Consulting. An idea can launch a business, a strategy can take it global. Gorillapreneurs, I do another podcast called Event Horizon, where I talk about the universe, religion, and intuition. Can you really use intuition in business? I interview Paul Rosenberg, author of Rogue Leadership. And in his book, he tells you to trust your gut, trust your intuition, and he gives you tools and frameworks on how to use that to improve business performance. I think you're going to like this interview. Now, I want you to also excuse some of the audio. I don't know what was going wrong with my microphone. It gave a little bit of background noise throughout the podcast. I hope you'll forgive me for that. But if you want to change that in the future, support the podcast. Go over to patreon.com/gorillapreneur and become a patron of this show and help us put a Fab Lab in the Black Belt South. Now, here's my interview with Mr. Paul Rosenberg, author of Rogue Leadership. Gorillapreneurs, welcome back to the podcast. I think we have a very exciting show for you today. We have with us Mr. Paul Rosenberg, and he has written a book called Rogue Leadership. Rogue Leadership. Let me say that for you again. And you know, on this podcast, we talk about leadership and what it takes to get your business from point A to point B. But before we jump in and talk about Rogue Leadership, let me tell you a little bit about Paul. He has a BA in Mass Communications and Sociology from the University of Denver and an MBA from the California Lutheran University. And here's what's really cool about his background. He is a stand-up comic and a former improvisational actor, in addition to being a leadership coach. Now, the coaches that I work with, if they were as cool as him, I probably would learn a whole lot more. Mr. Rosenberg, thank you for being on the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, I've only scratched the surface. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, I've been a leadership coach and consultant for over 30 years, and my focus during those 30 years has always been on the human side of things. So my view is that no matter the technology, the process you're using, whether you're a startup, a small organization, or a Forbes 500 firm, the key always is that work has to be executed by human beings. So that's where I put my attention, and that's what kind of rogue leadership is all about, is that human side of things. Before that, I was in business development. I led the first joint venture on marketing and training in the ex-Soviet Union under Perestroika and Gorbachev. So I have kind of a business development background to go with that. So that's what I've been doing the past 30 years.
So how did the stand-up comedy weave its way into your background?
A very important part of how I coach is to not take things so seriously and have a sense of humor. I think that's important for anybody out there who's leading an organization or who wants to lead an organization. Quick story. My mom was an improv actress. I was an improv actor with my twin brother in high school and college. We toured all over the U.S. And while I was opening up a new business for my company in Sweden, of all places, I was asked to do a tryout on an open mic night, and things took off. And I was doing my business hat on the week, and on the weekend I was a stand-up comic and toured Sweden and the United States after that. So part of why I think that's important is that it gave me the ability to align quickly. You don't have a lot of time when you're on stage. You have about 30 seconds to a minute to get those people on your side, because they're all there to kind of say, make me laugh or else. And so the ability to kind of read where people are and how to get them aligned has served me well throughout my coaching career.
That's an important point you make there, that first impression, that first minute of interaction, and getting people to align with where you want to take them, be it comedy or business. Is that one of the biggest mistakes that you see with many CEOs or startup executives, is that they fail to make that connection with people?
Absolutely. I think here's why. The pace of the world is so dynamic, and there's millions of bits of data coming at us, and we're asked to make decisions quickly. And a lot of the leaders that I work with think that by acting that they're taking care of things. And my view is that unless you connect and whatever action you take is meaningful, then you're just wasting your time. So what I see with the leaders that I coach is that they're usually all about, taking action, but not right action. And the right action means really connecting with your workforce, your colleagues, your clients, whoever that is. That has to be done so authentically and in a meaningful way. Otherwise, you're just checking the box.
And that may lead to better use of what you call that gut instinct. Let's rewind a little bit back to that business development and Perestroika. You opened the book talking about how that experience led to this book. Can you walk us through the scenario that you lay out in the foreword of the book around this business development opportunity in Russia?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of instinct. I don't want to scare anybody. We're not going to align our chakras or wear crystals. I think that it's a muscle that we all have, but we've kind of forgotten how to listen to. So just a brief recap. I was in a taxi cab sharing a ride in New York to the airport, and the guy said to me, you really should check out the Soviet Union. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. And when I landed in Madrid where I was headed, I just felt like, you know what, I have to explore this further. There was just this strong kind of gut instinct that said, you gotta start a conversation and go to where it leads. And I ended up talking with, meeting the ambassador in the Madrid embassy for the USSR. We began talking. He was fascinated about the work I was doing in terms of training and business to business and marketing. And then one day he called. I happened to drop by. I was just on my way doing something else, and I said, you know what? I need to stop by the embassy today. I had no reason to do that, and it ended up that the number 3 economic advisor for Gorbachev was in town. I got invited to spend a couple hours with him in the garden, and that's what started that whole business development journey. So I learned from that by listening to my gut, which is kind of contrary to what most people do. Most of us think, well, that's not logical, or that's not something that a leader should do. Most of us avoid that. I think going rogue means paying attention to what that inner voice is telling you.
So is that how you define rogue leadership?
So for me, rogue leadership is about, on a big macro level, letting go to gain more control. And we talked a little bit about the pace of the world and the demands on us. And my view is by going rogue, that to me, that's going against the grain and doing things differently, such as listening to your instinct more, such as taking time to make a decision when the boss is or your stakeholder is saying, I want a decision now. Take the time to reflect a bit. Take 5 minutes, take an hour. Don't get swept away by the pressures of that outside world. It's really about, again, simplifying things in a lot of ways. How you interact with your team. It doesn't have to be complicated, but we've all forgotten how to do that. We've all forgotten how to have that personal one-on-one conversation. We pop off the email, we text them, we grab on the phone instead of walking down the hallway. All of that is connected to rogue leadership. It's making that purposeful connection and just being more aware and simplifying what has become quite complicated, where we just check the box and we're so busy moving fast that we really don't understand the impact that we're having.
Now, in the example you mentioned with the former Soviet Union, you talked through a scenario where there's some gaps in time where there's no interaction, but you follow your instincts and reach back out to some of those stakeholders and get that conversation going again. Is that a good example of how you went against the grain? Is that an example of rogue leadership?
Absolutely, because we had been in touch and we hadn't had a conversation for a couple of months. And as I said, that day, the day I chose on a whim, it may seem like a whim, but that inner voice was very clear. You need to stop by the embassy today. And without that, listening to that, I would have missed that business opportunity. So that the logical would be, well, don't want to bother them. I don't have an appointment. All that noise in my head would have usually blocked me from doing that. But it just came up out of the blue and said, you got to go over to the embassy. And as it turns out, that was a powerful step forward in our business relationship.
How does one improve one's ability to listen to that inner voice? And how can I use it to improve my business performance?
Great question. And there's a couple of things that I recommend to anybody I'm working with. I think the first thing is to create the space to hear that inner voice. All of us, or a lot of us, you get on a plane, you're off on the business meeting, and what do people do? They put on those noise reduction or noise cancellation headphones. Why? Because they want to remove the noise around them. And I recommend the same thing. If you have a decision to make, particularly a decision that you don't know which way to go, or it's a decision that, could cost your company a lot of money or have a huge impact on your team, the first thing I do is I get out of the normal space you're in. This sounds counterintuitive, but step out of the office, go outside, go to a different place. Why? Because then you remove the camouflage that may be creating, an obstacle to you really listening to what you need to do. So it's get out of that space, number one. Number two, take some time to reflect. So turn off the computer, put away that cell phone that's, pinging you, and we all do it. The phone rings and, oh, maybe somebody liked my Instagram, or who is that? And we go right to that because that's the way our mind works. So shut all that off and then take a deep breath. And again, we're not going to get all, fancy schmancy here or metaphysical. Really take the time to take a deep breath and just think about what you want to do before you do it. So it's really a couple of easy steps that we have the power to do. We don't have to, again, get swept away by, the boss is on the phone. There's a great example in the book of a gentleman I worked with, and this was a very big company, and his boss wanted an answer immediately. I was with him. The boss was on the speakerphone going, you need to tell me what we're doing now. And John is his name. He did something amazing. He said, can I give you an answer in an hour? And the boss mumbled and said, well, okay. Because John wasn't interested in giving him an answer. He was interested in giving him the right answer or the best answer. So we all have to understand that we are in charge of that. We can say no. We can create space for ourselves to reflect, change kind of our scenery, and then we're going to be able to hear that voice a lot clearer.
I can totally understand what you're saying. I have a couple of examples that popped in my mind as I was going through your book. Early in my career, I got assigned to a client that was trying to develop a new pricing model. They had the luxury of having pretty much total ownership of the HGH transfer market. They had built a piece of software that could make it easier to transfer those payments back in the early days when people were just getting into direct deposit. They had 95% of the market, and yet they found themselves in a situation where they were losing money because their pricing structure was not set up to accommodate small banks as well as the super large banks on the other end of the spectrum. They needed a new model that was going to be more dynamic and give them more value on both ends of that spectrum. They had called in 2 or 3 other firms to put together a pricing model. None of them had succeeded to the CEO's expectation. And when we were called in, they were on the last, budget to get this project complete. And I was brought in as a junior consultant to help out a partner figure this out. My first interaction with the team after hearing all the facts, looking at all the data, was I need to go on a walk. And fortunately, they had a very beautiful campus built up into the hills of North Georgia. And after walking around for an hour, imagining what each customer looked like that they were serving, the answer came to me. And I ran back to the conference room, assembled the team, and sketched out the pricing model on the board. And within an hour, the CFO was in the room saying, he thought it could work. And we spent the next month doing many focus groups with each of their customer sets to see if they could stomach the change in the way the pricing was going to be rolled out. I credit that experience, that opportunity to get that space, as you say, with giving me the awareness of where I needed to go with that pricing. The time to imagine what those customers looked like, how they use the software. I just created a simulation in my brain, and all of a sudden the pricing solution popped in.
Perfect. That's such a powerful example of what we're talking about. So, I can't think of a better story that illustrates the power of taking that time than your story. That's amazing.
Now, in the book, you talk about stealth change management. And in my prior career, when we meant change management, we would go in after laying out a strategy and try to, quote unquote, right-size the organization to that strategy, pointing out to them where the gaps are in terms of skills and capabilities to execute against the new strategy. Why do you coin you coined the phrase stealth change management? Can you unpack that for the audience and let them know what you mean and how that applies to getting these benefits?
Absolutely. Change and the change strategy is great. Where it usually falls down after an investment of a lot of time and meetings in terms of where you want to go is in the execution of that strategy. And that's where I see a lot of my clients kind of stumble. So it isn't really the quality of what they want to do. It's about the quality of how they execute that. So there are some statistics out there that say that 70% of change initiatives fail. And they fail because they start off great. As I said, they may be exactly what the company needs. But after a couple of weeks, after the kickoff and the rollout and, you know, everybody's excited and we get donuts and pizza, whatever, then everybody kind of goes back to doing things the way they were doing before. So I coined stealth change management because honestly, in my view, it's not the only way, but a lot of times change can happen without that visibility. And I think honestly that sustainable change happens a day at a time. And I'll give you another example of someone who helped drive that, that's also in the book, is that this is a company that really needed to create their risk management strategy and focus. And one of the guys involved in that for his team said, you know what, I don't want to just do the process safety stuff and check the box and do the big stuff. I want to change how we approach risk day by day. So what he did was, without any fanfare, without letting his bosses know, because he was aligned with what they wanted, he chose not to go the initiative route. He chose not to go the training route. What he did was model that through the people who were influential in his team each and every day. So change can happen slowly. And the perfect example is, you know, when you're a baby, there's changes every day. You may not see them. And as we get older, the changes are less and less obvious. But my view is you can do that strategy and execute it in a stealth way without the visibility, because when you do the big initiative, there's resistance. When you do the big initiative, people get motivated for a couple of weeks, and then, as I said, they drop it. So a better way, in my view, is a consistent focus on that, lots of baby steps each and every day towards that, and then you avoid two things. You avoid the resistance to change, which is really hard for people, really, really difficult for people. And secondly, it's almost a seamless change where you don't rock the boat after you've been doing something the same way for 20 years and suddenly you're going from A to Z. So that's my recommendation, is look at ways to do that, build towards that outcome. Just do it every day consistently and not the big push up front.
And in that process, do you recommend that some of the goals, some of those baby steps that you're recommending, should those be offered up by the people who are taking those steps? So those employees who have to ultimately make that change, should they be part of that discussion?
They have to be, because here's what happens is that, to your point, a lot of times you have the big change thing that comes from the top, and the leadership goes, we're going this way. Let's say we're going down path A. A lot of times the resistance happens or the non-execution happens because they're not involved in the process. They're passive receivers of the information. Hey guys, we're going down path A. Now sometimes a lot of the companies I've worked with, they have the focus groups and they let everybody know, but at the end of the day, they really haven't had their voice heard. Not the shareholders, but the stakeholders, the employees, and oftentimes clients and third-party service providers. So my view is, I think that's a great idea, is that if they're a part of the solution and it's non-evasive, meaning it's baby steps every day, not the big push, it's more likely to land and they're more likely to be committed to that change because they are a part of it. So I think it's a brilliant idea.
Right. And I think to your point, with the big push can cause the employees to resist, but it could also produce behavior that you don't expect. The example that comes to mind is Wells Fargo. They set these extreme sales goals for their teams, and then the teams, in order to try to meet them, started creating fake accounts. And that's not exactly, I think, what the leadership wanted, but they set goals without even consulting their teams, and their teams had to find some way to achieve them in order to get their bonuses.
Yeah, that's a powerful example of change gone bad. And again, the answer wasn't that complicated. The answer to what happened wasn't that complicated. If they had taken the time to just ask those questions, get that input, make everybody understand what the objective was versus that pressure of setting goals that I have no part of. I'm just told to do it. I'm going to do what I'm told if I'm an employee. So another good example of the power of managing change. You can do the big stuff sometimes, but really managing it daily, simplifying it, having that clarity, and you're still going to get to the result you want. And I think, honestly, a more powerful path is that stealth change management.
Now, another term you use in the book is disrupting disruption. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
It's just my way of kind of taking a gentle poke at the latest, catchphrase. Everybody's a disruptor now. Everybody's disrupting. So my view going rogue is I want to disrupt the disruptors. I think that there's a place for that. I understand the concept. I think it has power and value. But again, now the marketplace is filled with people who are disruptors, and a lot of the time they don't harness. That can be a powerful tool, but it can't be used all the time, in my view. It has to be used with a purpose. And yeah, there's some folks out there who are always going to be just, creating the chaos. And out of that comes some good things sometimes. But I think you have to understand what you're doing in the big picture. And you have to ask yourself, are we doing this because that's what we're supposed to do because we're leading edge? Or are we doing this for a reason? So just my view is kind of a pot shot at the latest, greatest. I've worked with a lot of people and a lot of organizations. Some are Six Sigma organizations. Some are agile and like, hey, we're agile, we're Six Sigma, we're disruptors. But when you pull the label off of that activity, they're not really doing what they say they're doing. So I've worked with as I said, an organization that's world class that was Six Sigma. The whole leadership team were black belts. The whole company were green certified. It was about a 200-person operation, so not huge. And they checked the box on that, but day to day, they weren't really living, breathing, behaving as the organization they said they were. So that's just my way of saying, hey, check yourself. Great that you have the latest, greatest label, but if you're saying you're agile, are you really? Is that behavior manifesting itself in how you execute your work each and every day?
Right, absolutely. The example that comes to mind is the company Patagonia. They deemed themselves a responsible company, and they really tried to live it. And they went through an amazing journey. I think of less trying to disrupt, but to give themselves the space for real change. And when they realized that they had great selling products that were actually destroying the mountains and hills that people enjoyed climbing, the owner said, we gotta fix that. We have to, even if we have to stop selling that product, we can't be the guys out there talking about being responsible if our product is actually destroying the beauty that we love. And that the CEO put that challenge to the team. How do we give people the same thrill and excitement of climbing a mountain without destroying that mountain? They did the same thing with their clothing when they realized that they were using more water than a small city to produce the cotton needed for their clothing. And as they reinvented the value chain, they were able to rethink how they manufactured their clothing. So, yeah, I get what you're saying, that sometimes disruption is a cool buzzword, but it's not exactly how you get to the real change that you want to have for your company.
Absolutely. And I love your example because it goes to something else. I firmly believe that if you come from a place of value, the rest is going to take care of itself. So, right now there's a lot of companies who are looking at sustainability. They're looking how they connect to the community. The other thing, too, though, is it's good business. I mean, you don't have to sacrifice high performance and profit for being a good corporate citizen. I think that the message is you can do both. So that whole focus on, hey, we're disruptors or whatever, as long as there's value and purpose behind it, then you're going to be fine.
Right. You also mentioned in the book Tarzan Principle for Simple Communication. Now, I remember watching Tarzan growing up, and he was pretty simple in his communication, like me Tarzan, you Jane.
Yeah, so, exactly.
So how do we communicate with the Tarzan Principle?
Yeah, so I'm not recommending go swing from a tree or beat your chest. But there's something to be said for simplifying communication. Why? Because there's such a barrage. We get it every day, the text messages, the notifications, it's just coming at us. And so how do we make our voice heard within our organization? I look at Tarzan and go, okay, number one, simplify your communication. Use simpler words to convey what you want to convey. It doesn't have to be fancy. I'll give you an example. I talk about not using trophy words. In other words, you don't have to make it so complicated. I had a colleague who once, and I won't go into detail, but he once used the word asymptotic. And he was showing off. The problem was that nobody understood what that was, but in a leadership meeting, they all nodded their head as if they did, because no one was willing to kind of admit that they had no idea what that was. And it's a mathematical thing, and I'm not good at math, but nonetheless, don't use trophy words. More is less, and I think that's there's power in when you're engaging with your workforce. More is less. You don't have to drone on, and your message is going to be more powerful if you choose the right words. So think about your messaging, and that's a thing we all have to do every day. If I see somebody in the hallway and I have a conversation, that's a reference point as an employee or a member of the team as to what I want and who I am. So if we think about messaging and we say, go do X and get back to me if you have any issues, that's way better than, you know what, I was thinking about you doing X and what do you think? And let's go and, let me know how that is and we'll do a follow-up and blah, blah, blah. I mean, we can just make it so complicated that the person or the team doesn't get the right message. We all know that game. you've played it, I've played it, about gossip, right? And you pass that. That's just a sentence. Imagine how butchered a sentence can get at the end of gossip by the time it gets to the last person. That's why, again, go rogue, take a deep breath, and simplify your messaging. And the other thing I'd ask is be consistent about it. When you use the same language, whether you're talking to your leadership team, your employees, your client, your vendors, or third-party service providers, if you use the same language, that consistency gives them all the same touchstone. And what I mean by that is it's the same reference. They're not confused by what you're saying. Everybody hears the same thing because it's repeated continuously. So those are some of the tricks on how to be a good Tarzan or a Jane.
And I would expect that this would be especially important when stating a company's goals or missions. You know, I immediately go to President Kennedy and his simple statement of wanting to get a man to the moon and back safely by the end of the decade. Very simple but powerful directive that everyone from a PhD to the person, you know, at the bottom of the organization could understand.
Absolutely. Our words have power, and so often we throw them away like, they don't have an impact or meaning. And so when we purposefully, like Kennedy, pick those words carefully, especially to your point around mission and vision. Man, if that's not clear, if it's a 3-paragraph mission and vision statement on the wall with that nice gold frame, to me it's worthless, because if people can't refer to something simple and clear each and every day that should be the driving force in everything that they do, then you're missing an opportunity, and I think it can affect your performance quite dramatically.
Who are the leadership assassins?
That's a rogues gallery. It's kind of the antithesis of superheroes. There's some prototypes that I talk about in the book. I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you a couple of examples. There's the Big Daddy, Big Mama prototype, and that individual complains all the time about the fact that everybody comes to him or her. They can't make decisions by themselves, and everybody has to go through the leader. And most of the time when I hear that and I uncover the truth and pull the Band-Aid off the wound, it's because they won't allow their team to make decisions. So Big Daddy, Big Mama syndrome is, I'm gonna make all the decisions. I'm not gonna let you make decisions, and then I'm gonna complain about the fact that I have to make all the decisions. So that's a true leadership killer, because at the end of the day, if your team isn't executing and leading themselves, and it all falls on you, then I don't think you're a good leader. Then you're a one-man or one-woman show. Another prototype, which we've all seen, is the chameleon, who, it's the flavor of the month individual who keeps trying all these different things, but doesn't allow the new thing time to settle in and time to take hold. They're on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And in a way, it's a significant defense mechanism. It keeps, everybody in the team is being yanked from here to there every 6 months. And it just, whether you're a small organization or a big one, it has the same effect. It just kills innovation and growth, and people get fatigued and demotivated and don't really add the value they can if they had that, clear alignment.
So Rosenberg, I have really enjoyed our discussion. Can you tell the audience how they can find and buy Rogue Leadership? And then also tell us if anyone in the audience wants to connect with you and talk to you about your leadership coaching practice, how they can get in contact with you.
So, absolutely, and thanks very much. Rogue Leadership is available worldwide on Amazon, paperback and ebook. It's also on Book Depository and Barnes & Noble online. If anybody would like to contact me, please feel free to reach out. Here's a couple of ways you can do that. I'm on Instagram, Paul Rosenberg, _line. My website is www.rosenbergpaul.com, and my email is paulrosenberg.leadership.biz@gmail.com, and happy to enter into a dialogue with you. So thanks for the opportunity today.
Excellent. Well, again, we thank you for coming on the podcast. And audience, I think you have learned a lot today about how to be a rogue leader. If you want to learn more, get the book. Get the book, Rogue Leadership. So Rosenberg, again, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Let's do it again sometime. Appreciate it.
I want to thank Mr. Paul Rosenberg for coming on the podcast and talking to us about his book, Rogue Leadership. I want to thank you also for supporting the show. If you are a new listener and you want to support the show, then hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment. Do it in iTunes. Do it in the Apple Podcast app, Podomatic, Spreaker, wherever you listen to podcasts. Just hit like and subscribe. Like what you hear in Gorillapreneur? Then check out my other podcasts, Career Coaching X's and O's, career advice for executives seeking the corner office. Also, check out Gigging, Everything in the Sharing Economy. This podcast gives you news and predictions about the sharing economy. Find them on Speaker, iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, and CastBox, or any of your other favorite podcast listening platforms. I'll put links to these podcasts in the show notes. Gorillapreneurs, one more thing. I'm teaming up with Airbnb Open Homes, a program that enables community members to offer free, temporary housing to people displaced by disasters. We are in the middle of hurricane season, and we've seen many disasters around the globe. One of our greatest needs is making sure every resident has a safe place to stay. Now is the time to prepare. If you are able to offer free temporary housing for neighbors impacted by a disaster, sign up to be an Open Homes host by going to airbnb.com/M Peterson. That's airbnb.com/M as in Mary, PETERSON. You will only be contacted when there is a need. This will add a great tool to our community's disaster response toolbox. Gorillapreneurs, Scott Sullivan said it best in episode 7. Be a mace, sharpen those spikes, and remember, if you're not breaking something, your company might be the next thing that gets broken.
Thank you for listening to the Gorillapreneur, the Art of Waging Small Business Warfare podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, you may also enjoy the book Gorillapreneur, Small Business Strategy for Davids Wanting to Defeat Goliaths, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iTunes. Follow Mark Peterson on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Gorillapreneur. Now I want to close with a quote from the great Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first, then seek to win. Keep fighting, Gorillapreneurs.